were trying to rob him. The Pakistani media first speculated and then reported that Davis was with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. He was a CIA spy. The U.S. Embassy said that Davis was a mere technical advisor, and the State Department in Washington urged the U.S. media to go with that version of the story, which they did, until a British newspaper, The Guardian, reported that Davis was in fact CIA. Our starting point this week is Lahore, Pakistan. The case of the unquiet American, the disquieting effect that this incident has had on U.S.-Pakistani relations, and the noise that now surrounds the coverage and non-coverage of the story.
Pakistan. Tonight, an American man is in prison there accused of murder.
When the story first broke, it was a broad daylight affair.
It's just had blanket coverage in the Pakistani media. For the past month, the headlines have been entirely dominated by the Davis issue.
Investigations are underway and more facts about the shooting incident are being uncovered.
The situation always seemed a bit murky.
What had been painfully obvious, that Raymond Davis worked for the CIA, has now been reported.
Actually, the CIA connection was not obvious, not in the American media, because they did not report it until February 21st, 25 days after the killings and weeks after the Pakistani media were saying the shooter worked for American intelligence.
If you tune in to Pakistani television stations, day in and day out, they're talking about this incident, they're talking about the relationship with the United States, the fact that CIA spies are able to work with impunity throughout the country.
In the Pakistani media, it had been out there for several weeks that Davis was a CIA agent. News organizations were covering protests where you had Pakistanis in the streets who basically were holding up signs saying that this guy was a CIA agent.
It's been a sort of, media firestorm, really. We've had actual interrogation tapes from Davis with the police or in prison being released to the media and aired, and really this is, I think, pretty unprecedented stuff.
Initially, the Pakistani media's coverage ranged from the resourceful to the speculative to the bizarre. Reports that Davis was recruiting for the Pakistani Taliban, even supplying al-Qaeda with nuclear material.
The Pakistan media, in my view, has really been irresponsible in covering this. It's really infotainment. They bring on provocative guests who make a number of spurious arguments that are very much targeted to inflame and to arouse sentiments. You could say the CIA, I had a weather machine that made it snow in Lahore, and there's going to be someone that's going to buy that story.
But for all their editorial excesses, at least the Pakistani media were reporting the story with the CIA angle, which raised once again the problematic relationship that exists between Washington, Islamabad, and two intelligence communities that do not trust each other.
The media is playing a leading role in putting pressure on the government. Had the media not discovered this case, the government possibly would have made some sort of a compromise with the Americans, let Raymond Davis go. But the media itself is now putting everything back on the front. It wants the government to be on a back foot. It wants the government to answer.
For the first 3.5 weeks, U.S. media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Associated Press news agency, were all reporting the shooter was a diplomat. They later admitted they did that at the request of the U.S. State Department, which said revealing Davis's CIA affiliation might put him at greater risk. The State Department asked the same of the British newspaper The Guardian, but given what was already public knowledge in Pakistan, The Guardian did not cooperate.
There were several emails backwards and forwards where the CIA presented their arguments, but in the end, our assessment really was that the safety threat to Davis was not linked to publication of any story. They were already burning his effigy in the streets, calling him a CIA agent. So really, it actually wasn't such a great secret at that point. There was also a sense that perhaps the CIA was using this safety argument as an excuse to have him released as a diplomat.
Once The Guardian published, U.S. media outlets stopped censoring themselves, reported that Davis was CIA, and explained to their readers why they had held that information back. The New York Times published some readers' letters critical of the decision. One said, "Yet again, the Times has shown itself to be a willing pawn of the government's propaganda ministry." The paper defended the decision through its public editor, who wrote the Times did the only thing it could do. But even he asked, how can a news outlet stay credible when readers learn later that it has concealed what it knows?
The New York Times fell in a real trap here. It's one thing if the New York Times learns about something happening abroad, say if somebody is kidnapped in a war zone, and they simply don't report on it at all. But what the New York Times did is they tried to continue covering the story and publishing the statements from the US government saying he was only a diplomat, and ignoring or not giving much credence to reports in the Pakistani press that he was a CIA agent. So when you look back at these stories, they are misleading.
It was certainly gratuitous. It didn't fool anyone, but it also meant that any claim that the US government would then make from that point onward dubious, because they were in fact trying to use the media to conceal information about Mr. Davis. It simply doesn't work as a strategy.
Some media critics have saluted The Guardian for breaking the news embargo and provoking U.S. newspapers to follow. But would The Guardian have acted with the same independence had Davis been British, working for MI6 as opposed to the CIA?
When a government approaches a newspaper not to publish a story, there are two arguments it can make that are very powerful. One is that an individual's life is in danger. The other is that national security can be threatened. So it's very difficult to hypothetically say what would happen if a British intelligence agent was involved. But there's certainly no doubt that The Guardian would take those concerns very seriously and look at them on their merit.
U.S. officials fear Davis.
Because what news organizations in one country call a national security concern, the rest of the world's media just call news. And the moment Raymond Davis pulled the trigger in Lahore, he became a story, whether the CIA likes it or not. Our Global Village Voice is now on the reporting of the Raymond Davis story.
I think the concealment of this information by the New York Times and the Washington Post demonstrates that these U.S. media outlets place the interests of the United States government over the interests of the public and their right to know what their government is doing. I believe that anytime journalism begins to serve a state power, whatever power that may be, that it ceases to be journalism and has begun to move into the realm of propaganda.
You will not find any report in US print or electronic media which will portray Pakistan's point of view. Please don't forget the common people in Pakistan's busy marketplaces nabbed Raymond Davis and handed him over to policing and judicial authorities. Well, this clears, at least in our point of view, that his life is not a threat from people or government of Pakistan.
Davis is a murder suspect and has entered the judicial process of Pakistan. His CIA status is very material to that case, and withholding it would show contempt for the process.
If you've got an opinion on the news media that you'd like to get on the air as one of our Global Village Voices, we suggest you join the thousands of our viewers who already follow us on Facebook and Twitter.